So much. Good afternoon, everyone. When I spoke with the organizers about giving a keynote, obviously, we have heard a lot about AI and what AI is and is not, etc., the challenges. But I thought I want to focus my keynote on building AI for Europe. I think here, we have obviously a big crowd of entrepreneurs, investors, students, and I think I want to encourage everyone here to think about sort of how can we build AI for Europe? How can we make sure we are less dependent on other sort of countries, in particular the US and China? But I want to start actually with not so good news. So when OpenAI was training their ChatGPT model back in 2022, they had access to 14 times more compute power than we have in Europe combined. So just one company training a large language model in the US, 14 times more compute power than we have in Europe together. And then obviously you see all these other sort of data, a couple of snapshots here, how much money, is invested into OpenAI. NVIDIA plans to invest up to $100 billion in OpenAI as part of a data center build-out. Then OpenAI, just says, expects business to burn $115 billion through, 2029. And you look at it and think, how can we, as Europeans, compete with that? And I think there's also one thing, this is also something I'm getting a little bit towards what we can learn actually from that. So when you look at a burn of $115 billion for OpenAI, that's a huge number. But I think the way you have to look, and then people obviously also argue, we are running into a big bubble here. But I think when you look at the idea, and I think that's something we can learn as Europeans from the Silicon Valley, you have to basically look at the network. And the Americans have always been very good in building networks, networked products, and networked ecosystems. And when you look at this triangle, and I have not even included Oracle, which also plays a big role here, they have basically increased, the three together, their revenue by $185 billion over the last 3 years. So this is when you look at this ecosystem and at this network, and the net revenue increase is $185 billion at a very high margin, then I think it's not a surprise that you can invest hundreds of billions into OpenAI, which is basically feeding the development of NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Oracle. So the question is, what can we actually learn from the Americans? And why, when you look at this, you could say, okay, that's actually, game over for us here in Europe. It's a very discouraging sort of ecosystem. But I will show you a couple of points why I am optimistic as a European that we can actually still build great AI for Europe, and also make sure we have a tech sovereignty in this country. And I'll show you a couple of reasons why I'm so convinced that we have a good future here in Europe. The first is, it is not a first mover advantage. So we are clearly going here through the first wave, right? So the first wave was the internet. Then we went through the second wave, which was the cloud, and now we are in the third big wave, which is the artificial intelligence. But when you look at the past, and when you look at sort of what happened with personal computers, what happened with smartphones, who in this room remembers that the very first personal computer that was built by Olivetti? I think hardly anyone, right? Then we had obviously HP, we had Commodore, I think you need gray hair like I have, that you remember the Commodore Amiga 500 and stuff, right? So those were companies that actually were in the first wave and the second wave, but now it's basically all about Apple and IBM. The same with smartphones. We had Siemens, we had Nokia, we had BlackBerry in the business space, dominating years ago, and now it's Samsung and Apple, right? So this is not, history has shown, this is not a first mover advantage. Quite the contrary, late movers have shown that they can win the race. The second thing which is very encouraging is, and I want to start with the slide with the right-hand side of this slide. This shows how much time you need to get to 100 million users. So you had Spotify, it took them 11 years. You had Airbnb, 8.5 years. You had Twitter, 5 years. You had WhatsApp, 3.5 years. And now, look at sort of Instagram, it was already 2.5, and now OpenAI was 2 months. And then on the right-hand side, you have a couple of sort of examples here. Black Forest Labs on this green line, which was in the press raising money just now. They shot up within basically 10 months to 100 million euros of revenue. You have also the AI index obviously outperforming the SaaS index, right? So you can build businesses much faster. And Black Forest Labs, that's why I included them here, is a very good example. It's a company based in Europe. What does that mean for us as investors? And I think that's also something we need to talk about, because that's also part of the truth and also part of the challenge. So when you look on the left-hand side of the graph, you see how much time companies basically have between raising from seed to Series A and then from a Series A to Series B. So in the past, we were talking about, take 2019, it took basically almost 3 years to get from the seed to a Series A. That was, when you raised the seed, it was enough money to get to the Series A within 3 years. Now we talk about less than a year, right? In both cases. So you raise from seed to A on average within a year, and then you have to raise another round from A to B within a year again. Because obviously clearly that the technology we are talking about, be it AI, be it other deep tech ventures, takes a lot of capital to recruit a team and in all these other investments that are needed, right? So I think this is something to bear in mind. Things have accelerated tremendously. And then the other thing we need to think about is, also as investors, and I think this is changing the way we are operating. In the past, the tech risk was quite low. And the question was always, is there a market for it? Is there enough sort of marketing payback, etc. So the usual commercial terms, right? It was more about the demand risk, right? So in our portfolio we had the example of Vinted, Etsy, Bloom and Wild, typical marketplaces, B2C businesses, tech risk fairly low, demand risk very high. But as investors, we got comfortable with it. Now it's the other way around. Most of these businesses in AI, in deep tech, have a very high tech risk, be it nuclear fusion energy, AI, quantum computing. All of them have a very high tech risk. The moment they have the tech breakthrough, the demand risk is super low because it's so obvious, right? If you have a fusion energy that works, everyone will take it from you. The same with quantum computing. If you have managed to have a quantum computer that is running in a stable way, the demand risk is super low because the demand is obvious. When it comes to AI, and I spoke about this on the panel this morning, it's so important. I think that's something we need to focus on here, in particular in Europe, building AI companies in an environment where we might have less capital available than in the US. And the way we look at our sort of investments at BPI, we look at it like a cube. And I think there are two dimensions that are very important. The first is, although you are maybe a company that is focusing on a certain application, you need a certain depth when it comes to the tech stack and the tech stack integration. And the other dimension is network. You have to build a business with a product that has a network effect, because that is very hard to replicate and very hard to substitute. So I make an example. I met a company in Paris. I don't want to make promotion for it, but it's. I think I was quite impressed what they built. It's a company called Radium. And what they basically do is they build a small language model. They have created a network within French universities that share basically radiology images with them, scans, and the diagnosis on an anonymous basis. So what that means is this company is basically training a small language model with images from radiology and diagnosis from scans, to basically with the goal to basically democratize the access to first-class and world-class diagnosis. And what I mean by that is basically the application is clear, the use case is clear. Every one of us could then basically use it. If we have a scan and we want to have a second opinion, then you can basically upload your scan, and the system will tell you what actually is wrong, what is broken, what the treatment should be, etc. But what this company has basically achieved is, they have this application layer, but obviously they have integrated deeply into the value chain with the small language model, and have created that network with the French universities, which is hard to replicate, right? And they keep building. They want to expand to Germany now and to the UK. So that is basically a network effect and a differentiation that matters. And this is sort of a slide to remember why I think these network effects are so important. In the past, many of the most valuable companies worldwide have been built on network effects. On the one hand side, you must have a product with a world-class user experience that is a given. But then these network effects are so important, right? So the network basically refers to all active users at a given point in time who are connecting with and through the product. And I think this is important. It's not just connecting with the product, but also connecting with each other through the product. And then obviously the effect is, and this is where the scaling comes from, is the usage, right? So increased usage by any user increases the value of the product and ultimately of the company. And I think this is important when we think about building AI for Europe, building AI companies, all of us, that we have these network effects in mind, and they have, the history has shown, take YouTube, take Uber, Airbnb, LinkedIn, Vinted, all of them are based on network effects. And I want to leave you with one slide, and this is also why I think we have a great future in Europe. We have a great future in Europe when we, I think, join forces, and I think this is also my message to all of you today, and this is why sort of I was 2 weeks ago, I was in Tallinn, this week I'm here in Valencia. I think I want to encourage everyone not just to focus on your own country, but basically think about Europe and how you can cooperate. And I have brought you an example why I think it's so important. And I call this the Airbus initiative, right? We need more Airbus ideas, more Airbus initiatives. When you look back at the time, Germany, the UK, France, Spain joined forces, created Airbus, and they are now by far the largest commercial aircraft manufacturer worldwide. They have sold, twice, the number of aircrafts than Boeing, and I think this is what we can do here in Europe if we join forces. And I can only encourage you to think about what we can do, not just in your country, but across Europe. And maybe there are also consolidation opportunities. We need to build bigger companies much faster. Thank you so much.